Yeah, okay, cool. Okay. Excellent. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and you're all sat comfortably. So this is a more familiar slot for me, actually presenting on NEC rather than hosting. So over the next half an hour or so, Adrian von Plato, our CTO, and myself want to dissect, I guess, this question. So can we make AI help make contract management smarter? Before I get started, our team have been playing around with ChatGPT. They actually came up with some really good. They asked ChatGPT to come up with some ideas for icebreakers, some NEC jokes. I'll share them with you at the end of the day. Now, it came up with 20 or so, but actually 2 or 3 of them were scary how on the money they were. So I'll share you those with you later. In fact, maybe I'll give you the punchline and you see if you can come up with a better ending to those questions. So what do we have in common as an audience? I think we all have one thing in common in that we want to deliver projects successfully. I don't know if everyone knows about ChatGPT. Again, maybe use your cards, green or red. Has anyone had a play with ChatGPT with NEC? Yeah, it's quite interesting. So, and it's obviously been in the press quite a bit. It's quite scary what it can do. It's not perfect, but if there's anything on the web about NEC, it seems to know about it. It sometimes gets a bit muddled between NEC 3 and NEC 4, but certainly a number of our contributors have been playing around with it, writing multiple choice questions, writing blog articles, asking it questions about NEC, and it's surprising. It's got a surprisingly good hit rate, so we'll show you some examples of that a little bit later. But it doesn't truly understand NEC. It doesn't truly understand NEC, and whilst the collaboration that Microsoft's done with OpenAI that's behind ChatGPT, they've invested about £3 billion in it now, and it's now available through Microsoft Azure Cloud. It's still relatively complicated to implement. So there are lots of challenges to making AI services actually work in practice. And again, we still come up against a lot of people. Although we sell contract management software, and we do see a lot of contract management software being out there being used, we still see a lot of people that are just using spreadsheets or even just using paper. And obviously, it's really difficult if you haven't got that data online. So, yeah, over the next few slides, we want to just sort of pick that apart. So I guess to sort of frame it for you, we think AI can make NEC or JCT contract management smarter, but it's got a few challenges that it needs to do. So I guess first off, AI is good at certain things and it's actually really bad at some things as well. So we've got to find a really focused business case for AI to work, repetitive things where it's really niche and simple, and then we can train an AI to work on those sort of things. So there's certain things that we think it can do, but it's got to be really focused. We think an AI service needs educating in NEC and JCT, and again, a lot of the AI services out there are designed to be educated and coached. So again, if that's part of the mix, then it potentially could help make life easier. I think Tim mentioned earlier that he didn't see it replacing. I don't think we see it necessarily as replacing it, but it's certainly got an opportunity to sort of make marginal gains. And when we look at some of our biggest customers that are managing billions of pounds worth of construction contracts, even a marginal gain still adds up to tens of millions of pounds. And then lastly, as well, we think there's lots of AI services out there and we need a sort of modular approach to it. So there's AI services that will display ads to middle-aged men when they go in front of an advertising panel because it does facial recognition, recognizes that I might need some special cream for my hair or my lack of hair, those sort of things. It's quite scary how AI is being used these days. There's lots of different services, and some of them actually lend themselves quite well to the sort of data that we're sat on as a business. So let's take a little look at the sort of business case in sort of round numbers. So I think a few people touched on it today. Construction contracts, supply chains are really complicated. If you look at our Fast Draft product, we support probably about 30 different contract types. We support probably about 30 or 40 different workflows. We support also probably about 200 to 300 different notice types that are in a typical NEC contract. Yes, there's loads of different variables there. You then imagine that you've got 20 to 30 subcontractors and probably, I would say typically, probably 6 to 8 parties involved, even at tier 1 with lots of information flying around. And you can see down at the bottom of the slide as well, just like the sort of volumes of data that we're talking about. I'm sure that's something you can probably all relate to. You probably all get too many emails, but if you're looking at our biggest customers, they're getting several thousand early warnings a month, or 20, 30,000 notices a month across all of the different workflows. So you can start to see how, if we're using AI services to read all of those notices, we can start to enrich our clients' data to help them spot the sort of needle in the haystack, so to speak, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's like an extra pair of eyes. And again, if we look at the volume of days that our customers' supply chains are waiting for decisions that the NEC contract allows them to take their time. So, there's lots of obviously different timetables in NEC, but, if you add up, even if you've got a perfect client and he's making all the decisions within the timetables of NEC, you're still waiting 7 days for a decision. And I thought I'd use like a practical example of that. Yeah, so we're talking about, millions of project issues being raised a year across our platform, obviously much wider across the wider industry. And every one of those is a little bit like the guy digging the hole in the ground. He's discovered, buried services that's not supposed to be there, and there probably is 4 guys stood at the top of the hole waiting, who are being disrupted. And there's probably Chinese whisperers. There's a guy at the bottom of the hole who's talking to the guy stood outside the hole, who then goes and finds the site agent, who then tells the QS, who then logs it on Fast Draft, and then 7 days later, if the client's good, they'll get a reply to the early warning so they can carry on working. Yeah. So there's clearly lots of opportunities around that. There's huge volumes of data. So to our mind, we think there's a really solid business case there. And even if it is, like Tim talked about earlier, even if it is only marginally helping a user or helping a line manager spot a project that looks like it's at risk, it still could have millions of pounds worth of savings. So what sort of simple tasks could we use AI services to help with? Yeah, so we monitor with our reporting and analytics we talked about earlier, like generally how people are managing their NEC contracts on our platform. And there's lots of things that sort of fall by the wayside. So generally speaking, actually, teams do a reasonably good job of managing their NEC contracts. It probably helps that the NEC contract encourages them to manage stuff proactively and sets timetables and so on and so forth. But there's still lots of little things that fall by the wayside, like classifying and tagging your communications. Yeah, so whilst we might be able to tell you what proportion of your early warnings are dealt with on time, we might also support classifying early warnings by like a level of risk on them, probability, stuff like that. Things like that are still really subjective, and you've got even more granularity on every single early warning. There might be language in there or common themes around things like COVID. Yeah, so by having an AI service that can read all of your early warnings, yeah, and we've got a number of clients that have brought all of their early warnings and all of their data off of legacy systems. So, they've got 10 years worth of data, and even though they're huge organizations, there's no chance of them trawling back through, 2 million early warnings from the last 10 years. It's just not practical for an organization like that to do. But we can point an AI service at that and get it to read all of those early warnings and mine that data, and then maybe tag the sort of common themes for an organization, if that makes sense. Other stuff AI service can do, it can summarize stuff for you, do calculations, and again, it can do some of that stuff on the fly. ChatGPT is really good at that, and Adrian's got some examples that he can show you a little bit later. I also see a lot of early warnings that I don't even understand. The English is just not English, to be honest with you. So we see a lot of early warnings that, regardless of how quickly it's replied to, just the quality of the English on the actual notices is so poor, it's almost impossible to actually help the person who's raised the issue. So again, there's AI services. You may have come across a product called Grammarly that uses AI services, for example. We could be using that, again, just to try and raise the bar a little bit in terms of the quality of the writing that's on contract notices. There's also out-the-box services as well that do like chatbots, so you can point them to a common user case would be pointing them to just product literature. So you've probably discovered that if you've used the chat service in Amazon, for example, that it won't put you through to a human being until it's tried to redirect your problem to the relevant support articles. But the chatbot has read the articles and it's doing it all dynamically. They're not having to guess what questions a user would ask. It's doing it dynamically with AI services. So they're just some of the examples that we think would lend itself to we think it's some of the examples that would lend itself to just taking a simple task and trying to train an AI service to do it. However, as I said at the start, AI services don't really understand NEC or JCT, and just taking a simple sign like this that's translated, the number of things that I see sort of mistranslated in NEC language, again, is understandably perhaps worse than this or different to this. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a sort of test. So do we think an AI service can spot the difference between a good, bad, and a downright ugly early warning? Could we codify what that looks like so that we could then train an AI service? What do people think? Show of hands. Red or green, depending on. Okay, so got some believers in the room, so it looks like we think we can do it. Okay, cool. So the stuff I had down in terms of sort of good. So I think we could probably do good with a lot of the data we already have. So, are we getting regular early warnings? Are we getting them in a timely fashion? Are we getting them in plain English? I don't think we could do that without AI services. Have we got a risk mitigation against each of the early warnings, i.e. are they being thoroughly managed in the process? And then ultimately, I guess, are they actually getting mitigated? So we've got 5 or 6 KPIs. Down as bad was it comes with a CE, which you could argue is probably ugly. And I have also seen early warnings that came with quotes as well, or they're just completely confused between the difference between a CE and a compensation event. So, obviously you've got varying degrees of it. Again, just sort of sticking with this and trying to find some examples here. So again, it'd be good to see a show of hands. So I was quite fortunate to have quite a forward-thinking commercial director when I worked for a big utility company and rolled out CMAR. It was a roaring success, but partly because they were quite forward-thinking and really embracing the ethos of NEC. He had quite a novel approach. He almost wanted to set targets for early warnings, so he saw it only as a positive thing. He didn't care if we had 4 early warnings for the same problem because there was more chance of the project engineer actually providing a timely decision rather than holding the project up. So, if we were pointing an AI to these 2 different projects, would we flag, which one would we flag as being more at risk? The one that's got less early warnings or more early warnings?
Might just not be many issues on the other one.
Could be. You've hit the nail on the head. Yeah, it could just be a lucky project, or it could be a project manager who can't stand the contractor and they're just not talking. Yeah. It's not. That's not. I don't think that's an easy one to unpick. I mean, arguably, if there's more early warnings raised, then arguably there's more issues that should lead to delays and cost overruns. Personally, I'd probably take more comfort from a project that's raising loads of notices. I think it's a safer project, if that makes sense. And certainly if you're managing a really big capital works game, you do sort of manage by numbers, if that makes sense.
Just got a bit of a worry, Pete, that
contractors could use AI to generate even more?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Flood coming in.
I think that's a really, I think that's a really good point. I think you'd be foolish to bury your head in the sand about AI. I think there will be people who use it potentially unethically. There's already lots of user cases of that.
Anyway, so
Yeah. We do see a lot of that sort of thing. So I think it does make sense to be exploring this, and hopefully, therefore, you find this sort of presentation, I guess, interesting. So, in terms of how we're looking to tackle it, so we're breaking it down and building it out in layers. Yeah. So we have project data or client data. Yeah. We currently already augment that. So, for example, we know what the period for reply is. We know when someone's notified a notice, and because we know for the period for reply, we are calculating the due date for them, and we're adding to their data. So we don't just store in our platform the data that the client and the users are putting in, we're augmenting it already. AI has the ability to build on that model. What we're looking to do is build that out in layers. So the first layer of that is sort of algorithm-based segmentation. So it's sort of providing guide rails effectively for the AI service. So it's sort of saying, well, okay, this user's doing this very, very specific task, and we'll train an AI to work on that specific or an aspect of that specific task, if that makes sense. So we're building this foundation with algorithms. It'll probably have other components like a sort of NEC dictionary, like a simplified version of the workflows that are in NEC. I mean, at the risk of sort of stating the obvious, we'd be in breach of NEC copyright if we were incorporating like copies of the contract and stuff like that into an AI service. But actually, there's some key pointers and directions. So, there's certain things that naturally happen in certain stages, and we could use an AI service to coach users. So I started to break that down for you. Apologies, there's a lot of words on the screen there, but I'll just sort of talk you through it. So this is sort of like trying to illustrate how we might codify this process. So we might start by understanding what the user, what contract the user's using. Might then understand what the user's role is on that contract, where the user is in the contract life cycle, so whether at the start of the contract, reaching an anniversary of a contract date, or coming to the end of a contract. We then might define what good looks like in each of those scenarios, like a checklist of things that the contract requires the user to do, and then monitor again. This is all sort of algorithm-based, no AI is involved, but then start to collect the data and align it to those segments. How many of those users tick all of the boxes that they should tick in the first 30 days, an anniversary date, who's done all the things that the contract requires at the end of a project, if that makes sense, yeah? So we're doing that work, and I'll show you, because we've actually sort of launched in beta our NEC coaching that's done in app, and it's sort of going to act as those guide rails that I talked. And then what we do is, the idea is we then layer over the top of that some of the out-the-box AI services that Adrian will talk to you about in a bit more detail. So there's like AI services that understand the semantics of words. So you string a series of words together, and actually, depending on how you use the words in a sentence, it can have a completely different meaning. Yeah. So it understands the semantics of words and how they're threaded into conversations. So multiple different notices all talking about the same theme and what the overall sentiment of that is. And it can pick up on sort of dictionary sentiment out the box very easily. So if you're talking about disputes, it'll sort of recognize that that's generally not a positive word. We need to be a little bit careful. So when we talk about the guardrails, obviously in the early warning process, we're going to be talking about risk a lot, and risk is obviously not a particularly positive word, yeah? So depending on where the AI service is reading stuff, it needs to understand the context that it's in to understand the sentiment of it. I'm sure you guys would appreciate if you're getting an email from somebody and it's in capital letters with lots of exclamation marks, it generally means they're not happy, if that makes sense. AI actually understands those sort of things, and it does that sort of stuff really well out the box. So the idea is we'd use that, and then the AI services that Adrian will be talking about later, they provide, while they're designed for software developers, unlike ChatGPT, they provide like a panel or a UI where we can then start to feed in like an NEC dictionary and sort of next steps and solutions for sort of common problems so we can coach it, if that makes sense. And then the idea would be that we feed that back to users through the UI. So that might be, we've got a list of contracts as a line manager, and whilst we already support tagging within our platform, so like tagging against assets or tagging because you want to just group early warnings around themes like COVID, we can add another layer to that or another tier. So it'd be like machine tagging that says this project looks like it's got critical issues on it because there's lots of exclamation marks, they're talking about disputes, or maybe they're referring to anything within, say, Section 8 or Section 9 of the contract. Generally, like those sections of the contract, if there's sort of discussions in those sort of areas, it's probably worth escalating it to line managers. So that's how that sort of first layer of, or third layer would work. So the idea is that would feed back to users. So we're trying to provide them with a little bit more intel, and it's probably not going to be perfect every time, but it still should make their life easier, and we should be able to distinguish it from the stuff that's very black and white. You know, the due date is the due date, if that makes sense. And then there's, again, other AI services that can use things like,
What's ML? Sorry.
machine learning, yeah, so it's a bit of a sort of generic term for AI. So machine learning can do lots of different things, but it can look for things like anomaly detection. So that can work a couple of different ways. You could look at the relationship between like early warnings and CEs, and then you could plot that against the probability of projects finishing successfully. The example we had on earlier as well around the project that's got high volumes of early warnings, and machine learning would be able to look at all of your data and basically just say, well, statistically, actually raising more early warnings is actually likely to lead to the project being more likely to be delivered on time. But it'll be able to do that mathematically, so to speak, by looking at all your data and looking for the trends. Just trying to think. Yeah, other examples. Yeah, there'll be lots of other examples. I might let you cover that in a little while, Adrian. So if I just circle background, I guess, to that first sort of layer, because we're now sort of ready to roll this out in sort of beta. So this is an example of this is just a screenshot from our admin panel. So we can see here that we're dynamically segmenting users. Yeah, so we know, I know John's working for a contractor. He's on an NEC4 ECC contract, and this particular project he's on has started in the last 30 days. And John might be managing 10 NEC contracts, all of different flavors, and he might not even have the same role on them, and it's segmenting him into multiple pots. So if he's also running a JCT contract as well, we'll know who's running a JCT contract. And we can then feed him guidelines. So if his project's starting in the last 30 days, we know there's certain things that need to be done. Yeah. So, for example, we know at the start of an NEC project, if you've got any early warnings in the contract data, they should go into the risk register. We know that the insurance details should be provided before the start date, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so we're sort of nudging users, but actually that same nudging and guardrails we're providing to users will provide that sort of framework for AI services. So I'm now going to hand you over to Adrian, who's going to talk you through, I guess, the clever bit, the AI stuff, and how we can start to use that, and our sort of plan over, I guess, the next 6 to 12 months to start trying to roll that out and tackle some of the sort of big data opportunities we've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm glad Chris did leave out a comment on the slide where the guys are standing around the hole. That was actually the construction of our technical office at BI. We don't get let out a lot. So yeah, if I do overstay my welcome, hold up your green cards and I'll continue. So yeah, have a look at some of the flavors of AI that we're rather interested in BI to really drive some efficiencies. And it's been a topic on some of the conversations today to take the vast amounts of data that we have within our platform and really drive efficiencies so that we can bring those benefits to our customers through our products and platforms. So I'm just going to highlight a few that you can see on the screen there. Chris has touched on a couple of them already. And I guess one of the most exciting ones for us at this stage is anomaly detection. So what does that actually mean? What we're trying to do is to define what we think a good contract might be in Fastdraft. And that could be what we call a baseline. And the idea is to then take the data, whether it be data that's within our product itself or giving other potential customers the ability to import their data into our ecosystem so that they can compare their data against our data, basically. And the idea here is that we can then start to say, okay, well, based on what we think is good, these are where the deviations are in the data that you've provided. So an example of that, and I think Emma mentioned it earlier on, was a payment certificate. So we know with a payment certificate, there should be an application for payment, there should be the certificate itself, and if there's a difference between those two amounts, a notice for the pay less. So if we don't determine that, we can identify that as a potential anomaly in the data. Some other examples are classification of text, and having human-like conversations with the data that you've got, either within our system or data that you can import into our ecosystem. So examples of text classification could be sentiment in communicated notices that are going through Fastdraft. So are you creating too many early warnings this particular month, or what's the nature of those early warnings? Is it an early warning that relates to flooding? If so, the AI services can have a look at the data that we've got in our system and start to suggest, oh, these are actually other related notices that have a similar topic or theme as to the one you're raising. So this kind of leads to in-app coaching or trying to help our users use our products better and get more benefit out of the data that we've already got in that system. Another really exciting one is the ability to be able to search data within the application. And imagine this as sort of a Google search, an in-app Google search. So the idea here is rather than having to export huge amounts of data from our application and into Excel and analyzing that data yourself, you can start to have a conversation with that data. And I'll show you some examples in a later slide where we've actually provided some sample data to the AI service, and asked it questions around simple English questions to analyze that data for us. And the results are surprisingly good. There were some funny anomalies that came out of it, but it got better the more times you ask the conversations or ask the questions. Cool. So with any new technology, as everyone seems to focus a lot on the advantage of it, and there are huge amounts of advantages in using AI, even if it's just to drive efficiencies and to analyze your data. But there are also some limitations that we need to be aware of. So AI, as Chris mentioned, it's really good at this stage at doing simple things or simple repetitive things really well. So it gets a little bit more complicated when we move over to machine learning, and that's where we can start to describe or train the AI services on specific data in our user or in our ecosystem. So that's where we can start to look at things like data dictionary or concepts that are specific to NEC or JCT or other contractual frameworks where that information might not be publicly accessible or might not be that useful in the public realm. So I'm sure pretty much everyone in the audience will use Microsoft Teams. And the idea is what it's doing is it's analyzing the conversation that you're having and trying to suggest what it thinks would be useful responses to the conversation that you're in. So a really simple example of an AI service that's embedded in a Microsoft product that, and I'm not too sure how many of you use those responses, but I do tend to, and they usually are quite good. So, and I think William touched on a little bit earlier on how do we make sure that the benefits that we can get from AI are actually useful to our use case. And it's a bit like was mentioned earlier on, we need to invest the time and the effort up front. And that means not only training the models with our data and with our use cases, but also understanding how those services can bring benefits to our customers based on the data sets that we have in our products. So how do we plan to do this at BI? Chris touched on it. It's sort of a phased approach. Phase one is what we consider to already be in a beta phase. And we have started rolling these out in-app to some of our customers to get some feedback. But as I mentioned earlier on, the whole idea here is to really focus on understanding the data, structuring that data and segmenting the data in a way that will make it easier for us to train our models when we get to the more complicated tasks of machine learning, sentiment analysis on the content of the emails and the notices that we're sending through our products. So that kind of leads us on to phase 2, which we're still in discussion with our partners at Microsoft. And that's really trying to train these models in a way that makes sense to the data that we've got in our platform. So this is not data that's publicly accessible. So we can't just throw questions at it at a service like ChatGPT and expect useful answers, because it's just not publicly available information. And it's sensitive data. So we need to find a way to segment our data or segregate our data from everyone else's data, so that when we can start to train it, provide data dictionaries on it, and ask questions about it, we know that we're doing it within our own ecosystem. We don't run the risk of this information just being out in the general public. So that task is probably about 12 months away. We've already started looking at how best to define those data dictionaries and how best to train those models on the data that we've got within our FastDraft systems. And then the last holy grail, if you like, of implementing AI and ML services into our products and services is to start looking at the sentiment of those communications that we're sending, being able to benchmark or predict performance of our contracts against an industry, what's a good contract, and then allowing our customers to potentially, or sorry, not our customers, to allow someone else to import their data into an environment where they can do benchmarking against the data that we've got in our FastDraft ecosystem. And that's probably a couple of years away from us getting to a point where we'd be able to release that roll it out to our customers, but it gives you an idea of what we're working towards. And I've got it at the bottom there, and I'll show you some screenshots a little bit later, and that's to do with a question and answers type approach to conversing with your data once it's within our ecosystem. Okay, so why is AI important to data, or why are AI services important in analyzing data? So here at FastDraft, we're sending upwards of 400,000 communicated notices on a monthly basis. And for a business of our size to try and analyze that data to provide useful insights to our customers, it's just mission impossible. So if we had to try and employ hundreds of people to do that job on our behalf, it's just not cost effective. So we can work with partners like Microsoft to use their services in an enterprise way that allows us to analyze that data and really pass on those benefits to our customers. So rather than peppering you guys with hundreds of emails a week or a month relating to communicated notices in FastDraft, we can use AI services to say, look, highlight what's important out of those emails. So reduce the number of emails we are sending you, but the ones that we do send you really help you drive efficiencies within the tasks that you need to do. So from an architectural point of view, so this is gets a bit nerdy or geek speak at this stage, but I've tried to simplify it and show you how we've sort of identified two main areas of an implementation approach within FastDraft and AI services. On the left-hand side, we're looking at more sort of a cognitive approach to implementing these services. And what that means is using things like text classifications or human-like interactions with data to try and bring benefits and better insights into the data that we have in our ecosystem to our customers. On the right-hand side, it's the more complicated approach, but that's where we can really start to train these models and train the data that goes into the models, so we get a lot more accurate predictions of what we expect to get out of that data when we're using AI services to analyze it. So there's a lot more work to do on the right-hand side, but the benefits that we'll get will be far more accurate with regards to the nuances of contract management and NEC and JCT in particular. And then just for a bit of fun, and Chris will have a few more jokes a little bit later on with this service, but what we do is using our sort of internal BI bot was to throw some questions at it and really communicate with the service as if you're speaking to someone else in the office. And that was to ask it to analyze some CSV data that we had given it. And you can see, if you can read that, the conversation is really human-like. Hi, I've got some data. Could you analyze it for me? Sure, I'd love to. show me the data, which you do, and then ask a really simple question of how many early warnings had a late reply. It came back with the right answer the first time round, and when we asked it to identify which were the late ones, it got it completely wrong. But then after repeating the process again, it got it completely right. And it got better and better the more we asked it and the more we had these conversations with it. So it really is, there's so many flavors of AI that are out there at the moment, and picking the right one for your business and how best to, I guess, drive the efficiencies and get the benefits out of that is the tricky part. But that's where we're spending a lot of time and R&D to make sure that whatever services and flavors we do go with AI, we'll be able to get the best insights from the data that you have in our ecosystem and get that back out to you. Cool, so with that said, and before Chris sends me back to my hole, so yeah, Chris, thanks again for your insights, and especially from a technical point of view, it's always good to understand what the business case is for this, because it's easy for someone to turn around to us and say, go and make AI work with my data. That's a much easier task than to say, what are the benefits of AI being allocated to or being used to analyze my data. So yeah, if there are any questions to everyone in the audience, thanks very much for your time and for listening to our presentation, and happy to answer any questions if there are. If not, I can hand back to Chris.
One sort of, it's on the same topic, but could the likes of AI spot ambiguities and inconsistencies within the likes of the scope? I will repeat. Could artificial intelligence go towards spotting ambiguities and inconsistencies within the scope in the way that clash detection works in a BIM model or something like that?
So we actually, as sort of a proof of concept in-house, we sort of pushed a generic NEC type contract into the ChatGPT service and asked it to identify some anomalies or I guess discrepancies in the way the text was worded in that contract. And it did a half decent job of being able to do that. So once again, I think it depends heavily on the reference data that the service has got to be able to perform that calculation or that analysis. But definitely the more information you're able to provide it in the way of conversations, the better it gets at being able to identify, I guess in this case, a discrepancy or an anomaly.
I guess the average construction contract's probably going to run to 800 pages. It's going to be in a mixture of digital formats as well. You'll have stuff in Word, you'll have drawings. It might be a drawing that clashes with things. So I think if you unpick that, that's really quite a very complicated.
It's a big number.
Yeah, it's a big. Well, I think it's a complicated problem because it might be a drawing that's describing steelwork in red, and there's a specification that says it should be in blue. So taking something simple, but one's in the works information and the other's on a drawing. I think that would be really. I don't think there's anything that will do that out of the box. I think it will spot anomaly detections even in your data, like whether there's peaks in your construction activity or contract management activity around financial year ends, things like that. It'll spot those sort of things straight out the box. If you give it a load of data, it'll spot or it'll spot anomalies, i.e. this project seems to have 5 times the amount of early warnings it sticks out from the rest of your projects across your business, if that makes sense.
I had another one as well, which again, slightly tangential. Could you use the likes of AI and ChatGPT to respond to an early warning and come up with the mitigation steps, if any? If this run of pipe work needs to be moved, could it come up with that idea?
So I think you can get pretty close to that out the box. It's quite scary that it can come up with jokes, and they're not all funny, but there's some of them actually. They sort of make the answers sort of make sense. Yeah, there's a couple that are proper dad jokes. Yeah, out the box. Yeah, and it can still write a introductory article on what NEC is, the form of contract, and it's pretty close to the mark. So there's not a lot of people who would want to necessarily know the basics of what NEC is, but it's pretty good at writing a completely unique article on that because it's read all of the articles that are probably on your website, John, and everyone else's websites, but it will come up with unique content. So I think it could do that quite easily. To our mind, I think the slightly simpler tasks that would fall into sort of phase one, which would be just sentimental analysis of all the notices, is a bit easier because that sort of works out the box. But I don't think it would take too much if you, for example, if you said to ChatGPT, this is what section 16 of the contract says about early warnings, I've got an issue, you could literally type in, I've got an issue with the site being flooded. It would draft, I would have thought, a compliant early warning, and you could tell it to write it in plain English, and it would grammatically write it in the present active tense and stuff like that. It is quite scary how much it can do out the box. But even technically implementing it, as Adrian touched on, ChatGPT is a public service. We can't go pushing our customers' data into public service. What's quite good is Microsoft have licensed the ChatGPT product so that we can build it into our products quite easily. So yeah, I'm quite excited about the R&D phase. And again, I think it'd be really interesting to collect user cases like the ones you've just come up with from customers and prioritize them. So we'd look. We prioritize every feature on our roadmap based on what's called a RICE methodology. So we look at how much reach will it have, how many people can we help, what's the impact to the individual users, what's the confidence, i.e. can we actually articulate what we want, or is it really complicated even if there's lots of value in it, and then there's level of effort. Yeah. So really simple, really quick, high value stuff is the stuff we want to do every week. And there'll be certain ideas that I guess you as users will come up with that'll be pretty high up the list. So I think my gut feeling is there's probably some quick wins to be made with AI services, but also the potential risks as well if we're coaching people wrong and we don't realise the bot's coaching people to do the wrong things. It could have quite a detrimental impact to our customers. So quite a bit of work to be done.
There was another question that had come through, which was around data protection and data sensitivity, and as Chris touched on it, it's how can you use these AI services in an ecosystem where you still are in control of your data and I guess the insights that you can draw from that data. And I mean, we do try and cover it as best we can in the terms and conditions that we have in terms of how we handle and deal with your guys' data. But I guess it's a little bit of an unknown still at this stage because it's pretty new technology and there's not that many use cases where it's been done before.
Any more questions at all? No.
Joke time.
Excellent. Yeah.
I just asked ChatGPT to generate a poem about NEC4. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so here's a limerick about NEC4. There once was a contract called NEC that aimed to improve project delivery. It evolved to NEC4 with some new features and more, and became the best choice for the industry.
Not bad, yeah. The one I had, I've got a few, I'll have to go and dig them out there on my phone, but I'll give you one of them now, which was, what's the difference between NEC4 and a love letter? I think I haven't quite got this right. One's a legally binding contract and another involves mutual trust and cooperation or something like that. So I thought it was pretty good. And then there was another one as well about contractors and why they want to become NEC experts, because it's cost recoverable, I think, was something like that. So it's still quite scary that it can browse the web and come up with some clever anecdotes. So it should be interesting. We have to watch this space. Right. I think... So I'm hosting whilst also speaking. So I think we've now got refreshment breaks and we have overrun a couple of minutes. If we could be back here at 3:55, we've got a presentation on the major updates that are coming with the public procurement regulations. So grab a tea and coffee.